If the world was ending, what would you do? Laugh, cry, maybe? Well, if you were Miles, you'd go where the action was hottest. If you were Lord Miles Rutledge, you'd probably say the world ain't as bad as Birmingham in broad daylight. This is a story of 4chan's very own war reporter. In the world of tourism, there's a dangerous subsection called disaster tourism. The kind of tourism that gets gap years beheaded by organizations of terrifying persuasion. This runs a thin line with independent war reporting as more and more outlets just ignore the outside world from America. Well, I mean, we acknowledge that there are other places now, but that's only because the body count was high enough. But Lord Miles Rutledge, he was always there, always in the action. Always where it was hottest. Before we even cover the conflicts Miles has been to, we need to explain what this guy is. And yes, technically he does hold the honorable title of Lord. He got a certificate, walked into a British bank with a suit, and basically BS'd himself into getting the word Lord on his bank details. So in a way he is a British Lord, but not really. I guess it could come in handy, right? Miles had a simple goal, a simple 20-something's goal, to risk his life by any means necessary. And basically he went on the internet and Googled dangerous places as if he was shopping. And well, he was off. Miles became a learned man of paths less traveled. He went to the war in Ukraine, Chernobyl. He almost made it to North Korea, but then we had one of those horns of the apocalypse that happened, and Miles was rerouted to Afghanistan in 2021. The trip was booked for a hot trip around Kabul in August. And little did Miles know, the Afghan military would topple in days, not months, as all the military analysts had predicted. So, some history about America's foreign entanglements, because everybody was really confused over what happened and why. These were really rough, to say the least. Afghanistan was a hard one. These wars in the Middle East have been alleged to be about oil, and let me just knock that out right now. The oil thing is a populist myth. This is a brief primer, but it helped me look at Afghanistan in a new light. So let's get into it. In 1973, Afghanistan became a fledgling autocracy by way of a bloodless military coup. You see, the king, because they were a monarchy, he was actually away on holiday in Italy, and it was the last holiday he ever got because now a dictator was in control of his government. For a while, the country had been modernizing actually and going through a process of westernization under the monarchy. The photos of the time are absolutely stunning. But you see, a little thing called the Cold War was raging, and both NATO and the communist bloc were fighting in a series of proxy wars, this ideological debate over what form of government should rule. Needless to say, the autocratic rule started to stoke tensions inside Afghanistan as if it was being played by other political players. This new dictator was definitely not a walk in the park. He removed pretty much all political dissidents, removing communists from the government, taking away religious freedoms and personal rights of individuals. He angered liberals and conservatives alike, and his foreign policy was making it really hard to be an Afghani during this time, with other governments getting pretty pissed over what was happening. And then in 1978, the communist PDPA, with the help of an angry military, launched a coup. This time not bloodless, this time with lots of blood. The new People's Republic of Afghanistan was now fighting a civil war, as the PDPA did basically the same thing as the autocratic ruler before it, but this time they wore red and said comrade and then displaced a bunch of people. This is where some of the original Mujahideen had began their fighting. These religious fighters would become someone else's problem later, but right now the US was helping these freedom fighters through the Pakistani government, providing things like training and weaponry and in particular Stinger missiles to blow up Soviet tanks, which yes, I know what that sounds like. They're not exactly the same, but I think it's a funny anecdote. Now for another one. One historical note about these freedom fighters is that one of them was particularly famous. You might have seen him before. Yep, that's Osama bin Laden. And anyway, this is where the Soviets came in to protect this communist government that was budding in Afghanistan. Some other stuff happened, but now we're in the middle of the Soviet-Afghan war. Soviets fought through the deserts, and the US, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and yes, China all supported the rebels. Unlike today, this was actually a covert operation, but it wasn't a resounding victory for the Soviets. The country had become absolutely war-torn by all this back and forth, and warlords would come to rule different regions, and civil war would take over the country, Warlords were divided either ethnically, regionally, or religiously, and foreign intervention would pretty much always fall through. The Taliban were the ones to gain a few provinces, and they quickly separated themselves from the pack, primarily through their military tactics. And then when 9/11 happened, the US asked the Taliban to hand over bin Laden and al-Qaeda members related to the attack, and the Taliban obviously declined. And by the way, these groups are separate things. People use them interchangeably, but they're two separate groups. Anyway, after that, the US and Britain launched Operation Enduring Freedom. Now, many groups at this time fled into Pakistan to regroup and fight back against the US insurgency, I guess. Fight back against the US and Britain and NATO and all that. Again, cutting over a lot here, the US helped a very war-torn country try and build a democracy. But on top of them building a democracy in the light, the Taliban in the dark built an underground government beneath them. And while NATO had been training all of the Afghan police and military, it wasn't going to be enough. So the US basically was there to fill in the gap in what the Afghan military couldn't do and try and stamp out any insurgencies. When the time did come to pull out, military analysts had predicted that, Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, would hold for a while. And in a trend that's becoming increasingly common, military analysts were also wrong because Kabul only lasted a few days. Ironically, none of those analysts ever spoke to Afghans who were fighting because many of them were rightfully scared shitless over the Taliban and how brutal they could be in urban combat. Miles is in the city at this very moment. The moments that Afghan soldiers are deserting their country and trying to escape on US cargo planes. His journey was chronicled on 4chan because he said, and I quote, "I have almost a first-class degree in physics and an investment banking job. Yet, I'm incredibly retarded, yes. Also, I don't think you understand. The reason I came is because of the news," end quote. Support the channel and subscribe and see channel videos like this. I can't speak. Anyway, some people ask for alternatives to Patreon. I will definitely set those up, but I do have merch if you're interested. But in the future, there'll be more ways to support the channel. Many people called Miles a trust fund baby, which he denies, saying that his family was poor and lived off of welfare, that he was risking his life on his own dime. Posting from a safe house, Miles would relay the world as it fell apart around him, saying how the streets of Kabul had a constant acid-sick smell, the noise was unreal, and that poverty was rampant as small kids would bang on his car window begging for money. There was another rumor about Miles that started as well, because it was a little strange of this random guy to go to Kabul. It was almost that he was a bit glowy, that maybe he was a Fed. I genuinely don't know where this is coming from, as if this guy is a deep state agent, but usually they don't divulge sensitive details that can harm high-value targets or harm assets of the US government or NATO or any of that. Anyway, Miles went back to the airport to try and escape Afghanistan, and in his own words that'll live on in infamy, Miles said that he was in a bit of a pickle as he turned around to look at some Taliban fighters in an armored car because no flights were leaving. It was indeed a bit of a pickle, but the UN was there to protect their foreign nationals. They had safe houses, and Miles basically just decided to shitpost from a UN bunker filled with foreigners now stuck in a war zone. Miles shared more details of his life, how he was quote-unquote based. He exposed the man who runs the Taliban, and surprisingly, that's also the ghost of Kiev. Some could say he gets around. Now, Miles had, I shit you not, exposed the personal details of an interpreter, because these are high-value targets to the Taliban, because these people assisted foreign forces. An Arma YouTuber is the one who protected this person's identity. An Arma YouTuber who's also an amazing journalist, Remy worked with his Arma gaming friends to protect the interpreter's identity. An Arma YouTuber did this. Meanwhile, journalists said Miles had a 4chan account. This was all crazy enough, but luckily Miles survived, and on August 17th he was evacuated on a plane to Dubai, and he never went into a war zone again. Miles hears of these rising tensions in Ukraine, and I should mention he also went to Kazakhstan and South Sudan, but Ukraine's the one everybody's talking about. Also, Ukraine isn't getting a historical recap here. Just for time's sake, I'll direct you to a video from History with Hilbert or any other of those channels that I have linked down below. Anyway, Miles printed off a press badge this time because he wasn't just some guy, he was press. He decided to be a journalist. In fact, there's no rule or system of press badges. You can just make one and say that you're part of journalism. If you make it convincing enough, anybody will believe you, right? Make Art Now has an old video on this. I have a press badge, I made it myself. It's not that hard to do. Also, in Miles' defense for people calling him irresponsible for going to war zones, there are also other independent war journalists just like him in these areas, you know, trying to make their money by filming and photographing and selling it to networks later. He's not doing anything different really, but usually big publications give you like training for this sort of thing, so you know, you don't die or step on an IED and can point all that stuff out. But you know, Miles doesn't need training. He has God on his side. You know, I wouldn't want Miles to die, and he's upfront about his bias as a Christian reporter, so maybe he can block the damage from a cruise missile with holy. Listen, man, he just made Jesus part of his branding. I don't know why. Okay. Another anecdote, newly minted war reporter Miles is talking to InfoWars. Look, man, I've watched a lot of Miles' stuff now, and I don't really know what he adds to the discussion of conflict journalism, but there he is on InfoWars. You know, watching Miles explore these places and do these things is kind of like watching Mr. Bean walk through a war zone with his British mannerisms. It's really strange. His entire Twitter has been a security risk since he landed in Ukraine. It fluctuated wildly from Miles shitposting to Miles reporting on the death of a little babushka he saw earlier. I mean, Miles traveled across all of Ukraine, hanging out with soldiers, being questioned on whether or not he's actually a spy, destabilizing nations as if he's some harbinger of the apocalypse. Allegedly, according to Miles, he is exposing the fake news of mainstream media. That's a can of worms I'm not opening today, but I mean, I looked through his Twitter, it's all shit posting, and then on his YouTube, it's just live streaming from whatever location he's in. He made anecdotal rebuttals to mainstream press, but I couldn't find any hardcore fact checks here. I'm giving Miles the respect of calling him a reporter because I'm using that term very loosely. I just wouldn't want to give away my location while I'm standing there, you know what I mean? I mean, if it's not secure, especially, right? I don't think anyone wants to become an international incident. I mean, could you imagine Miles in North Korea? Wow, big mistake. Miles chronicled the Ukraine trip more than any other trip before, creating a whole brand and business around his misadventures, complete with live streams where people could look at military hardware and identify troops on the ground, and later on in one of these videos, Ukrainian soldiers stop him and ask him for his passport. Unbeknownst to Miles, he just wandered into a restricted area. Meanwhile, his comments section keep patting him on the back for doing the hardcore reporting the mainstream doesn't want you to see. And I mean, if you watch this clip, you don't really see anything. But I mean, I guess the mainstream doesn't want you to see the floors of Ukraine. This basically encapsulates his time reporting in Ukraine, because in the middle of it, Miles got a call from God or something, and went from reporter to missionary, and he started handing out candy to kids, getting a beater car with a friend, and smuggling food and supplies into Ukraine, and smuggling women and children out. Miles throughout all of this kept joking that he's a Fed, by the way, which is just, I don't know. Apparently deep state agents are playing like 4D chess and created Miles for some reason. Maybe he does spy stuff in the off time, but I don't know about that. Miles does seem to have this uncanny ability to get into places he absolutely should not ever be able to. And all the while, this alleged spy Miles is shaking hands with soldiers, and some of which actually threatened to shoot him if he stayed in Ukraine too long. Miles wasn't truly trapped in a life and death scenario like Afghanistan. Granted, he could have died, but if he's exposed to one thing, he's exposed how easy it is for people to believe you when you just lie. I mean, Miles is an excellent liar. It's really impressive how he's able to convince people that he's legitimate in every place that he goes to. It's so hilarious. And then, he's moved on to YouTube to become a reporter, so I guess, I don't really know how to feel about it. Speaking of Miles getting into places that I don't know how he does, Miles is just absolutely on his way up in the internet world. I can see him becoming the next Paul Joseph Watson. I mean, hilariously enough, here's Miles in a Hollywood movie. Yes, director Isaac Nabawa confirmed it. Miles is gonna be in a sequel to Who Killed Captain Alex? I mean, I don't know if it is a sequel to Who Killed Captain Alex. It's just another movie in that vein from that part of the world. So Miles is now an actor. You know, when I was researching Miles, this video only felt like it's the first 2 chapters of Miles' story. As if, you know, he's only just getting started. This is not going to end well for Miles. It would be really interesting to see him go to a place like North Korea where he absolutely does not have the kind of freedom to walk around like he did in, you know, other places. But maybe he'll be able to BS his way inside, you know, the most secure places in Pyongyang. But, you know, I do wish Miles the best of luck, even if I have differing opinions from him sometimes, or I find him going on InfoWars a little funny. Miles is an interesting guy. Anyway, if you guys would like to follow me on social media, you can do so. And also make sure to subscribe and hit that bell. Take care, and goodbye.